Wildlife by Cynthia DeFelice. Chapter 20. Eric was too stunned to speak. To his relief, he was saved from answering by Big Darrell, who cleared his throat and said hoarsely, "I expect you could use some food." "Aren't you going to yell at me?" Eric asked. He was sure that's what his parents would have done, once they'd seen that he was safely home. It was certainly what he'd expected from Big Darrell. "I'll leave that to your grandma," Big Darrell said with a tired smile. In the porch light, Eric saw the weariness etched into Big Darrell's face and understood for the first time how much both of his grandparents must have suffered while he was gone. I'm sorry, Big Darrell. Was Oma real upset?" "I guess she lost 2 pounds for every day you were gone." Eric winced. "What about my parents?" "We were going to tell them in the morning." "You didn't tell them yet?" Eric asked incredulously. Big Darrell shrugged. "There didn't seem any point to it, not until we knew something for sure. There was nothing they could do, all the way over there, and your grandma didn't want to upset them. She kept saying, hoping really, that you'd come back." Eric shook his head in wonder. He was relieved that he wasn't in big trouble, with his parents anyway, and deeply puzzled by the apparent change in his grandfather. He started to follow Big Darrell inside, then paused, looking down at Quill, who was sitting and waiting patiently. "What about—" he began. Before he could finish, Big Darrell surprised him again by saying, "The dog, too. I don't need to ask if she's hungry. Not if she's like Elvis was." Sitting in a chair in the warm kitchen seemed unreal to Eric after his days and nights outdoors. To add to the unreal reality, Big Darrell was acting nice. He had allowed Quill into the house without blinking an eye. He and Eric were having a normal sort of conversation. After so much time spent talking to no one but Quill, all of this was making Eric feel a little punchy. "Oh, she's hungry all right," he said. "You got any dead moles? Rabbit poop?" Big Darrell laughed, a deep, hearty sound Eric hadn't heard before. Then he glanced toward the ceiling and said, "I hope I didn't wake your grandmother. I think she might finally be getting some sleep." They didn't say anything for a while, as Big Darrell moved from the counter to the stovetop to the toaster, his brow knit with concentration. Watching him, Eric guessed that Oma did almost all the cooking, and that the kitchen was unfamiliar territory for his grandfather. But Big Darrell worked carefully and methodically, and the mouth-watering smells of sizzling butter and frying eggs and ham soon filled the room. The quiet felt comfortable, not at all like the charged and hostile silence that had surrounded Big Darrell before. Eric was glad for the change, even if he didn't exactly understand it. And he was so tired he almost dozed off sitting at the little oak table. When the food was ready, Big Darrell filled 2 plates, slid one onto the floor for Quill, and placed the other in front of Eric, along with a glass of milk. Quill gulped her food, and so did Eric. When he'd finished with a large swig of milk, Big Darrell said, "I need to tell the sheriff's office you're back." He made the call, saying that Eric was back unharmed and thanking them for their trouble. After he hung up, he said, "The dispatcher says he can't believe nobody found you sooner. There have been a lot of folks looking, you know. We weren't sure whether you'd run off or gotten lost. The sheriff asked if maybe you got in a car with somebody and headed back to New York. We just didn't know what to think." "I'm sorry. I thought, well, I don't know what I thought. I didn't have much of a plan. I just—" "Wanted to get away?" Eric nodded. "The day you took off, I came home to find the house empty. Do you know your grandmother actually got in the truck and drove off to look for you?" "She did?" Eric asked in amazement. "But she doesn't drive." "Not for 34 years she didn't. I guess she does now." Big Darrell actually grinned as he said this, and Eric grinned back. "She's the one who figured you didn't want to be found. She believed you'd come back when you were ready, and I guess she was right." Big Darrell was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a huge yawn and said tiredly, "I think we'd both better hit the sack." That sounded like a wonderful idea to Eric. But before he slept, there was something he needed to confess. Big Darrell didn't seem angry, but he didn't know everything Eric had done. "A man found me and wanted to turn me in for a reward," he blurted. Big Darrell nodded. "We got a call about that." "I got away from him, but he took Dan's gun." "We heard that too. Seems the fellow showed up at the sheriff's office thinking he'd get a reward for returning it. They set him straight about that. We'll be getting the gun back." Eric let out a sigh of relief. Big Darrell was headed for the stairs. "We can talk about all that tomorrow," he said over his shoulder. "You're home safe, and that's the main thing." Eric and Quill followed, and Big Darrell paused outside the bedroom on the left at the top of the stairs, the one that had belonged to Dan. The door was open. "Good night," he said. Eric stood still, unsure what to do. Big Darrell added, "It's a boy's room. Your grandmother says you should have it." "You're sure?" Big Darrell nodded. Eric stood in the doorway for a moment before going into Dan's room. He was very tired, and when he looked around, he wondered if he might already be asleep and dreaming. The photograph of Dan that had been on the dresser was gone, along with the Purple Heart and the dog tags. On the wall, instead of the flag, was an old painting of a hunting scene. He climbed into bed with Quill curled up beside him. He didn't know how long he'd slept when he was awakened, not by a sound, but by the peculiar sensation of being watched. He opened his eyes to see the outline of a figure standing by his bed. "Oh, Eric," Oma whispered, "I didn't mean to wake you. I had to see for myself. You are here, safe and sound, and—" Her voice broke then, and Eric could hear that she had begun to cry. He got out of bed and hugged her, patting her back the way he remembered his mother doing when he was little. He felt awkward doing this, but the darkness helped. He was surprised by how glad he was to see her. She touched Eric's shoulder and smiled. "Your mama couldn't stand to be around Big Darrell the way he was so quiet and angry acting all the time. She left as soon as she could, and it was like we lost her too. When she sent you out here to us, I can't tell you what it meant to me. Having a boy around the house and a dog brought a lot of old feelings back. Then when you left," she shook her head, "I couldn't bring myself to tell your mama. I didn't want to worry her when there wasn't anything she could do. But also I couldn't bear to have her think we drove you away too." She sighed, and for Big Darrell it was as if he was losing Dan all over again. Eric recalled the man who'd caught him in the barn saying that the old man was pretty upset. At the time, Eric had been sure that meant Big Darrell was angry. He shook his head and said again, "I'm real sorry." "Well, I'm not," Oma said firmly. But it was awful for you both." "It was," Oma said, patting his hand, "but it was wonderful too. It brought Big Darrell back." Oma gave his hand a squeeze and got up, saying she wanted Eric to get lots of sleep, and he was left to contemplate what she had said. Every bit of it felt confusing. He had expected to be punished, even felt he deserved to be punished, and yet for reasons of their own, Oma and Big Darrell had forgiven him. At the same time, he felt remorse for putting his grandparents through such worry. He treasured the days he had spent on the prairie with Quill. He didn't regret any of what he'd experienced, even the bad and scary parts. He even felt a weird sort of pride that he'd been wily enough not to be found by the searchers, and that he'd come back on his own. He had wanted to make big, real decisions that had consequences, and, out alone on the prairie with Quill, he had. He had survived, and that felt good and important, but what he did mattered here, too, in the world of people and family, and he had never imagined that such a momentous change as the one that had taken place in Big Darrell could have come about because of something he did. He thought of the question posed in his mother's drawing of the geese. How will you live your own wild life? It was a good question, after all, even for a kid. But it was one he'd have to keep asking and answering. There was one part of it all that he did understand clearly, the part about being afraid to lose what you love, because he loved Quill, and now he had to give her up, and he didn't know how he was going to bear it. Stay tuned next time for Chapter 21.